Hecht, you could start.
Good evening. If I can begin by thanking Yankee Berman and all the staff of Operation Survival for putting together this evening, as well as all the past evenings, as those that have been watching over the last few weeks. There's been a series on some of the most important topics facing our children today. Most of you should be well versed with the famous Hayom Yom that says, the Rebbe writes that a parent every single day should think about their child's Chanoch for at least 30 minutes. And if that was true when the Rebbe wrote it, how much more so and truer it is even today, that the challenges facing our children is greater than it ever has been. And therefore spending 30 minutes, if not more, every single day is very, very apropos in today's challenges. Today's topic is maybe one of the most important topics, the topic of eating disorders. First of all, on some level, it's one of the most serious, one that is so easy to overlook. And as you will hear this evening, sometimes it's the issue itself, sometimes it's the symptoms of another issue. And unfortunately, it is an issue that can lead to mortality and other terrible things, chas v'sholom, if it's not dealt with. And unfortunately, it could even begin at a very, very young age. So tonight will definitely be very insightful, and we have a lot of information. And I commend you for joining us tonight. I'd like to just mention that once again, we find ourselves in the month of Iyar, the month of Ani Hashem Reifecha, that the Eibishter is our healer. And as we know, the Eibishter sends the refuah koydem hamachla, that God sends the healing before he sends the sickness. And as we pay attention to all our children's needs, certainly the need for their physical well-being, so too we have to pay attention to their spiritual, emotional, mental well-being as well. Tonight, we are honored to have with us Temimah Zucker. She is a licensed social worker that specializes in eating disorders. She herself struggled with this, and after recovering from her own struggle, immersed herself in the field and is today a national speaker on eating disorders and body image. And she writes on the subject, and I encourage you to participate through asking questions. There is a Q&A. Feel free to type in and just click anonymous, as nobody has to know who's asking the question. Thank you for joining us this evening. Dr. Temimah Zucker, without further ado.
Thank you. Not a doctor, though I do get that a lot. Thank you so much. I'm really, really humbled to be here. So I wanted to start by telling you a little bit more about just me and, what brought me here and the work that I do. So Temimah Zucker, I am from New Jersey. I am a licensed clinical social worker, both in New York and New Jersey. So I work at this point virtually with individuals struggling with eating disorders, body image, and disordered eating. And as was stated, I come to you with the background of being an eating disorder survivor, if you will. And that part of my life is very much a chapter that has ended, and I'll talk more about that. And so I come to you really more from the clinical side as a licensed therapist, licensed clinical social worker, whose training is specializing in eating disorders. Though I think sometimes it's helpful to note that my information is both personal and professional, if that makes sense. So I'm not going to be doing a PowerPoint. I'm going to just be speaking whenever I present on this subject. I like it to be, although we're not having a full-on conversation, since I don't see all of you or any of you really, I want to have it be more of a conversation, if you will, than a lecture or something that, I'm presenting through some type of presentation. So what I want to hit on in terms of the agenda tonight is a little bit, many of you probably, or most of you saw the flyer, a little bit of the signs, symptoms, causes, and then I really want to touch on eating disorders in the Jewish/Frum community, and kind of how to help, what to look for, and a lot of misconceptions, because I think that is a major part of this, that, I'd be remiss not to mention the parts of eating disorders that people assume to be true, or they assume that what they hear, through the media are true, which are often not true at all. So just again, a little more background. I went to the Wurzweiler School of Social Work. I've been practicing as a therapist. I was working at an eating disorder treatment program in Manhattan for 7 years. And my most recent role there was the assistant clinical director. And now I'm just working individually with folks and speaking on the subject and writing on the subject. So one thing I want to mention that the flyer noted was about sort of like this idea of taking control. And the most common word people think of when they hear eating disorders is control. I've heard that from so many individuals who will say, oh, it's all about control, right? That's what this is. And in my mind, that idea that this is all about control really kind of minimizes and is too vague in terms of how this works. It's sort of like saying, oh, it's all about stress. Like, yes, and it's not all about stress. That's one element, and it's an easy way of kind of encompassing. So we're going to talk about kind of what else is it about. And in my mind, it's not, recovering from an eating disorder is not about like giving up control. It's about reflecting on our ability, in terms of recognizing this is what I have choices around, and this is what my choices are limited around, and accepting both those things as true, which is a classic therapy theme. It's called a dialectic. It's accepting, two things that seem to be opposing, but are true at the same time, and knowing that you can have acceptance and also see that something is still hard. So just a little note. So I want to start by diving into some of the myths and misconceptions about eating disorders. I'm going to go through a few. If you have questions at any point, feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A. I'm going to do questions at the end, but this way, if you feel like you're going to forget it, you can put it in now and we'll get to it later, hopefully. So the first myth or misconception, and I have here, I keep this next to me. This is where I do my sessions. This is a Lego flower. And I always use this. I show this to parents. I show this to clients that I'm working with. The main myth and misconception is that an eating disorder is really all about the behavior. So we think about a flower. I don't keep the visual, but we think about the top of the flower or the blossom or bloom, whatever we want to call it. That's the part that gets our attention. That's the part that when if you give someone a bouquet of roses, they're not saying like, oh, these beautiful stems. They're saying, oh, wow, look at the red, the vibrancy. Eating disorders get this reputation of being all about the behaviors. And the idea that comes with that often is, okay, so when someone stops the behaviors, we'll talk more about what that means, then that means they're recovered, they're done. When in reality, when someone stops using behaviors, really with most behavioral diagnoses, that's when the pain often gets even louder, if you will, because the coping mechanism that the person used is no longer there. So I always tell people it's not a car wash. It's not that when the behaviors stop, the person is better, they feel all better. That's not it at all. So we have to pay attention to the stem, if you will, which are the thoughts and the feelings. And even beneath that are the roots. The roots are what we can think of as core beliefs. So beliefs that someone has about themselves, the world, or people around them, or viewpoints, or lens by which they see the world or themselves. And those beliefs often, they're not born with them necessarily, but it could be negative beliefs like I'm unlovable, I'm not good enough, the world is unsafe. And the person then uses, behaviors to cope with the feelings that those beliefs bring about. And so when we help someone stop the behaviors, which is an essential part of the process, we aren't necessarily making them stop having feelings. We never stop having feelings. So then we have to address the feelings and the underlying issues, if you will, that led to those behaviors. So that's the first misconception, is just like, oh, you can, an eating disorder is all about what the person is doing. That's barely touching the surface. So that's one thing. So what is an eating disorder about then? People just think of it as like this image in their head. There's this classic cartoon of, a woman looking in the mirror, or like now it's like an apple and in front of a mirror and seeing a much bigger reflection. An eating disorder is about the mental and emotional pain that the person is experiencing, and the way that that person is using food, exercise, their relationship with food and the body to cope or to communicate. Some people call it a disorder of communication, in the sense that the person has turned inward and used food as a means of communicating. Even if they don't want anyone to know that there is a problem, it's a way of communicating even to themselves, or maybe subconsciously to the people around them. There is an issue here, and I don't know how to deal with it, if you will, or it's a distraction. The person doesn't know how to cope, and so food becomes all encompassing. There are all these rules that are made, and it's a way of coping in that manner. It's also called a disorder of like development, in the sense that it's very common that disorders come out during major life changes or transitions. And that doesn't have to mean young adulthood. There are eating disorders that at times develop in midlife, when there are, you know, other changes, whether it be to the family unit or the body, that is sort of when it comes out, sometimes for the first time, which I think is another myth. I'll just go right into that now, that eating disorders are this like young, white, female, upper class diagnosis. No, eating disorders, unfortunately, there are no rules for who has an eating disorder. So about a quarter of individuals with an eating disorder are male. It's likely higher than that. However, most of the time men experience a higher degree of shame coming forward and naming that there is a problem. And a lot of these statistics, which are sometimes hard to find, come from, let's say, treatment programs, which would imply that people who go there, you know, usually have insurance, things like that. So there are so many numbers that we really don't know anything about. So this idea that, you know, the person is like a teenage girl, that's not true at all. We see people of all ages. And, you know, as was noted, unfortunately, we're seeing hospitals need to open wings for younger and younger children, as young as, I think, 6, although there could be other cases that are outliers, because they're starting at really young ages. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about kind of what leads to an eating disorder soon. So this idea that like it's one type of person is one that we need to kind of throw away ASAP. It might, I don't want to say appear, but it might present differently for men and women, in the sense that sometimes the body image, you know, dissatisfaction for women, that comes from a place of wanting to be thin. And for men, it's more about wanting to be lean or muscular. So that is a difference. But for the most part, this is a mental disorder that, like I said, and I can't stress enough, it's about pain and difficulty coping with pain or stressors. Oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes there's trauma that leads to, you know, someone struggling with an eating disorder. And it is not something that people wake up and choose to do. This is not this conscious choice. It's not contagious. It is something that people might feel like there is no option around. It could start slow and then get worse over time and become sort of a slippery slope. But it's not sort of this like, I'll wake up and decide to have an eating disorder. There really aren't these bounds that I think a lot of people assume come with it, in terms of, you know, the population, I should say, for who struggles. So I hope that makes sense. There's also, I'm going to kind of keep moving through some of these misconceptions. There's also a misconception that, you know, when we think of eating disorders, usually when I do this with a crowd, I ask people to raise their hand. What do you think the most common eating disorder is? And almost always, unless there's someone there who kind of knows the deal, almost always someone said, you know, most people will say, oh, anorexia nervosa. And then I say in a very playful way, nope, wrong. And then, you know, someone else raises their hand, oh, it must be bulimia nervosa. And I say, nope, also wrong. And people at that point, sometimes someone in the crowd knows, like, okay, is it binge eating disorder? And the answer to that is, of those 3 kind of main eating disorder diagnoses, yes, that is the most common eating disorder. However, there's another disorder called OSFED, for anyone who kind of knows a little bit about the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, that used to be called EDNOS. What do those things stand for? EDNOS is eating disorder not otherwise specified. OSFED is other specified feeding and eating disorders. And what does that mean? There's this big old book, the DSM-5, that's on my bookshelf right over there. And it has a criteria of all the, you know, different mental disorders. And so that helps, you know, really in terms of diagnosing someone, looking at, okay, it's usually like out of 9 things, they have to meet criteria for some of them. In the DSM, EDNOS or OSFED now, the DSM-5 is when someone doesn't meet full criteria for one of the main 3 disorders, they are under this kind of other category. Now, much of the time, people don't meet criteria because an eating disorder doesn't really follow the rules in that way. And so it is actually the most prevalent disorder in terms of like kind of having a mix of different behaviors, maybe not following or falling under, you know, the criteria for, you know, this often, this many times a week, things like that. So it's the most common, but then isn't it interesting how probably what people think of with eating disorders is anorexia, and that is the least common eating disorder. It is the most well-known. It gets the most attention. Least common, which I think if you walk away with not much else, knowing that, this is a mental disorder and that the eating disorder that you think of, that's not the most common one. So least common is anorexia nervosa. Second least is bulimia nervosa. Then binge eating disorder, that's the most common of the three, and then OSFED. So I'm just going to go in briefly and explain just a little bit of like eating disorders 101 about what those disorders are, so you have an understanding, and then we'll talk a little bit more about some of the outside info around them. So we'll start with the most prevalent, binge eating disorder. That is when someone struggles with binging. Now we use this word very colloquially, if you will, in terms of like, oh, I binged a TV show or something like that. A binge in binge eating disorder is when someone typically feels like they're eating and it feels very, the best expression is really out of control. It's eating a large amount of food in a short amount of time. And the nature of a binge is that the person feels like it's very compulsive. Sometimes they dissociate while they're binging, so they really can't hear or see kind of what's going on around them because it's such tunnel vision. And I think that people think of binging and they think of like, oh, it's having an extra helping or something like that. A binge really is a large amount of food. Now, someone could binge on a regular meal because the nature of it was very rushed and compulsive and feeling out of control. But usually a binge is like more food than a person might have in a given day even. And oftentimes the binge food, it's not always, again, there's no always here. We're going to break down the dichotomous thinking. We'll go more with the dialectic. It's not always like this, but oftentimes people binge on what they usually restrict themselves from eating. So for a lot of folks, that could be dessert style foods or snacky foods. If they're, binging often comes from restriction. It's a cycle where someone restricts themselves and then their body is sort of like, nope, can't do this anymore. And they end up binging on the food and then they feel a lot of shame and then they go right back into the cycle. So that's binge eating disorder. And there's a certain amount of times per week in the months. Again, this is all in the DSM, but I'm going to kind of break it down just in the easy terms. Then bulimia nervosa, again, this is one people often get wrong. They think that is when someone throws up their food. That's not bulimia at all. Bulimia always is a binge followed by some method of getting rid of the food or compensatory behavior. So the most common ones are purging, vomiting. It could also be through exercise. So, when I ask clients or, talking to someone that I'm working with, okay, do you ever purge? They'll say no. And then I say, oh, do you ever exercise to get rid of food that you ate? And they'll say, yeah, all the time. And I explain that's considered a purge. So bulimia is when a person binges, always binges, and then follows it with a purge. Now, sometimes someone could struggle with bulimia and some of the time, they had a purge without a binge or a binge without a purge. But for the most part, it's really both. It's usually a cycle in quick succession oftentimes. And purging is usually done. So vomiting, laxatives, diuretics, exercise. And someone who struggles with anorexia nervosa, again, the one you probably, know the most about is when the person has an intense fear of weight gain, which is pretty common with the other disorders as well, and restricts their intake. And sometimes also that comes along with compulsive exercise. Now, if someone, this is where, I think for people who have maybe seen a depiction somewhere, like they get it wrong. For someone eats what's considered a normal meal, sort of like sits down to dinner and then does something to get rid of the food, that is not bulimia. That would probably be OSFED, or maybe if the person restricted, there's actually anorexia nervosa, binge or purge type. Now, you don't need to know this in terms of diagnosing. And I always tell people, do not go ahead and start diagnosing people. There are professionals out there for that. And I want you to know the distinction because oftentimes people who struggle, if the people around them assume, oh, you have to look a certain way to have an eating disorder, which is the next misconception, then it will be harder to ask for help because what they're going to experience potentially or think they'll experience is a family member, a doctor, a friend, someone saying, you can't have an eating disorder because you're not like emaciated. And that is one of the hardest things. Imagine someone finally coming forward and asking for help and the people around that person saying, no, you can't possibly be struggling. You're not doing it right. Based on their misinformation. It's really typically based on or ignorance or naivete, if you will. So I want to educate you all so that you never make that mistake. The next sort of big misconception, which leads into all of the talk about diagnoses. And like I said, you don't have to know, what is what, or, oh, that person does this many times. Does that mean, don't worry about it. It's really not even about a label. I tell clients all the time, I want to help you figure out a diagnosis if that will feel validating for you. And for the most part, in my mind, diagnoses are about insurance companies because it's about your pain and not about a title or a label. The most common misconception is that you can spot an eating disorder. Oh, you can tell because the person, their weight is different, things like that. And that's usually geared toward restriction and toward anorexia, which is already one of the biggest myths, is that to have an eating disorder, you must be thin. Most people with an eating disorder are not thin. There's extreme shame for people, who are struggling a lot of the time because they feel like they failed at their eating disorder because they don't look a certain way. When in reality, like I said, most people don't. There's a category of anorexia that people call atypical anorexia, or of OSFED, I should say, that people call atypical anorexia, which are, we clinicians are really working hard to get that atypical out of the label, because it implies, oh, the typical person with anorexia loses all this weight. It's not about the weight. Eating disorders are never about the weight. So I'm holding on to this Lego flower here. That is the top. The weight is the top. For some people, their weight never changes. It's about the behaviors, the actions, and more importantly, because the behaviors and actions, like we said, could stop. It's really about the thought process, emotions, and underlying beliefs or issues. So someone's weight could never change, and they can be, really harming, their body. So we have to really take that into account. And so tell this to medical professionals all the time, who also, someone will come forward and they've been mustering up the courage for weeks to finally say, like, oh, for X many years, I've been struggling. And what does the doctor, nurse, again, friend, whomever it is, say? Oh, well, no, that can't be true, because you don't look like you have an eating disorder, which is so unbelievably painful. Again, imagine this person really just finally admitted to themselves and are asking for help. And what they're being told is, no, your struggle is not bad enough. You're not, quote unquote, sick enough, which we hear clients say all the time as a fear. So this myth that you have to look a certain way to have an eating disorder is it's such sort of an old school thought. And we know now that eating disorders are really more prevalent, and that you can't spot one. So I always tell people, when they ask, okay, what should I be on the lookout for? So one of the things is changes in behaviors around food, not eating publicly anymore, bringing your own food, let's say, to an event because you're afraid of what the food there will be, things like that. Now, again, it's not always. So if you're thinking, oh, I know that person who does it, oh, it must be an eating disorder. Not saying that. These are things to look out for. A lot of preoccupation in terms of body size and discussion around losing weight and exercise. And I'll talk more about how prevalent that is just in our culture in general. And mood changes. Shifts in how people sort of just show up in the world in terms of their interests and socializing, because some people can hide it really well. And there's always a mood and emotional component. I've had people say to me, okay, my eating disorder is just about my body. I just don't like my body. It's nothing else. And I tell them, no, not to invalidate their experience, but that's not an eating disorder. There's always an underlying emotional component. There's always underlying pain, even if you don't know what it is. Even if it feels like, well, it's just the same as everyone else. I'm stressed about this thing in life. This person, this big change happened. There was a loss, whatever it is. So no, I can't have an eating disorder because it has to be this big thing happened to me. And that's where it's sort of no, there are no rules. People cope with pain in different ways. And this is one of them. So looking out for changes in mood, changes in behaviors around food, sometimes changes in weight, but notice how I did not put that out there as the first one. And changes in weight could be up or down, but that's not the main thing that you're looking out for. And so just sort of, again, to highlight and support this idea that it's not about the weight. And it is about the weight just in the sense that some folks are in a danger zone and they need to gain weight, let's say. So it's not that, that has nothing to do with it, but it's not truly about the weight or how someone looks. And so, whenever I have clients who I've been working with for months and months who say, no, but Temimah, for me, it really is about my body. I'm pretty straightforward, and I'm playful, and just sort of like blunt and try to be gentle, not judgmental, but blunt, and say to them like, okay, but that's not real, in the sense that, and they say, yeah, I know. It just in the sense that, like, if there's a body preoccupation and it's just about the body, that doesn't typically lead to a full-fledged eating disorder. There has to be a mental component, which is why it's in the DSM. It's a mental disorder. Okay. Another couple of misconceptions are that it is about choice, meaning people choose, like I said, so I kind of touched on this. People wake up and choose to have an eating disorder, or that they can just choose to get better. Just get better. Just eat a burger. Just eat a cookie. What's the problem? It's not that simple. It's sort of like telling someone, just learn that language right now. Just go learn the language in 2 seconds. When in reality, really recovering from an eating disorder is like learning or unlearning, a certain type of language. I should say it's more about learning, because the person has to familiarize themselves with learning how to feed themselves and not compensate, and also not be incredibly harsh and bullying toward themselves, because usually we call it the eating disorder voice. That voice is a very harsh, mean critic. And then there's the healthy self voice. So we try to engage the clients, or the people struggling, if you will, not just to listen to that eating disorder voice, but to challenge that. The other idea, so just real quick, I'll recap that. Feedback like, food is so delicious, just eat food. Oh my gosh, it's so great. That will never help anybody. Or feedback saying like, if you really wanted to get better enough, you would just be better. It's not a car wash. People don't decide that they want to recover and come out and they're sparkly and, feel like I can conquer the world. It's about learning how to sit with feelings and sit with discomfort and not use this pacifier, if you will, that has felt like a way of coping, especially because for the person struggling, it's what's called egosyntonic, fun little clinical term, which means that it feels good for the person, typically. And it sounds irrational. It is irrational. So if you're trying to approach this with logic, that won't really be your best friend, in the sense that saying to someone like, well, aren't you worried about your body? The person might say like, I know I should be, but I'm not. And that's workable in the sense that someone can work through that, but it's not rational. And so saying like, just eat the cookie, eat the burger. You still love food. I feel like you do still love food. Oh, just like, why can't you stop? Why do you binge? You don't want to throw up. That's disgusting. None of those things will help. Saying to the person, like, how can I be here for you? What do you need? Which hopefully I'll touch a little bit more on, like, what else can you do? But that's like the main key, is just, how can I be here for you? What do you need? Validating, seeing the person, not trying to say like, no, this is silly. You're such a rational person. That's not helping them. There are tools. There are totally tools to help them, that help get them in touch with that kind of wise, called the wise mind side of themselves, not just the emotion-based side and not just the logic-based side, but just sort of putting it out there as expecting a car wash really doesn't help, and can make the person feel like they're alone and misunderstood. There's also an idea that eating disorders are about vanity or attention. It's possible that a secondary benefit of the disorder could be, I'm getting more attention because I'm struggling and I've wanted that. That's something that we don't have to judge that. Okay, that person has felt like they were not being seen or given what they needed, but it's not this flippant, like, you just want attention or you just want to look good. Like we said, can't stress it enough. It's a mental disorder. It's about so much more than that. So kind of categorizing it as something that people, just do because they're vain, that's disregarding the fact, first of all, it's judgmental. And second of all, it's disregarding the fact that this is a mental struggle and a disorder, or an illness, if you will. I think a lot of people use that term, and it makes sense because that's how we have to think of it. So one sort of last myth that I can think of is that, and this one is there's still a school of thought, I think, that would contest this, but this myth that if you have an eating disorder, you are forever in recovery. I use the language, and I am not the only one, I am recovered. I no longer engage in any eating disorder behaviors, and I no longer have eating disorder thoughts, which took a long time. I don't share numbers. I guides specifically don't share numbers, because then people always compare and they think, okay, well, if she had it for this long and she's recovered, and look, she is so past it, and I had it longer. Okay, so I must not ever going to be, recover. Or someone might say like, oh, we really nipped this in the bud quickly, which is one of the research shows that kind of targeting or tackling the disorder quickly and getting help can really help in terms of the longevity, if you will, of the recovery process. Then they might think, oh, so if she had it that long and it's only been this long, I'm gonna have it that long. So I don't share numbers, but I will say that it's not overnight. It's not a car wash, like we said. And so I do use the language, I am recovered. I also respect when people say I am, in recovery, but there's a myth, I think, that like, if you have it, you will always have it and always be battling it forever. And I, again, not just speaking for myself, I'm speaking from research and so many individuals in the field and clients I've worked with who sometimes, X amount of time later, they'll say like, if anything, my relationship with my body is so much better, than before. And when I am sad, I cry. And I've learned how to communicate my feelings, and I no longer use food to cope, and I'm accepting of my body. It's not necessarily about loving your body, it's accepting of my body. And I know that my worth is so much more, and that it does not depend on how I look. And so sometimes I think the misconception, like I said, is that it's sort of like you have to maintain a certain lifestyle. Now, yes, for a while, people, I think, hope that like, all right, car wash, in and out. I'll go to that treatment center. I'll see that therapist. And after a couple of months, I'll be done. That is rare. It does typically take longer. And so it does require a lot of kind of investment and falling down and getting back up many, many times. It is not a linear process, which is another myth and misconception. And there are many people out there, again, myself as just one of them, who then put it behind them. So when I introduced myself earlier, I said I'm a survivor of an eating disorder. And interestingly, like when I think about eating disorders, if you just threw that word at me, I think, oh, that's my work. I don't think about myself because it's so behind me. Now, again, I am also one person. Someone else could argue or say something different, but I'm also not the only one who uses that viewpoint. And some folks say like, that's too much pressure. This idea that like, I could be done. I don't even know if I want to let go of it, because people, it's like a pacifier, even though someone who's older might not make sense for them to use a pacifier, whatever it is. They also know that it's really hard to let go of because it's comforting. So some people will say like, I don't like thinking about it as like, I'll fully recover because I almost need to just be in the moment. Other people will say, I can only do this if I know that it's possible, because I need to see and talk to people like you and know that there is a light at the end of this. So I'm going to switch gears real quick and talk a little bit more now about the prevalence and eating disorders in the Frum Jewish community. The statistics are lacking. I will just say that there are some studies, many of them have had very small sample sizes, so are not actually reliable in terms of, it's this of this many people, this many people had eating disorders, so it shows it's like X, times, 4 times as likely, whatever it is. A lot of those studies, first of all, are much older, and second of all, don't actually have a great sample size. And there's, I think, a lot of secrecy and a lot of protection in terms of many issues, and not wanting to talk about struggles, although I'm so grateful that this is happening because we're talking about it. It is real. And so we need to acknowledge that. And so the statistics are lacking, but I will just say that it's very much there. I worked in a treatment center, like I said, for 7 years. We almost always had one client who identified as Frum or Orthodox. And the program, let's say one of like 16. Numbers are hard to find. There are programs that have opened in the past that have been specifically for the Frum community. For whatever reason, they don't stay open always. Sometimes it's funding. Sometimes I think, like I said, there's a fear of how will this be viewed? How will it be judged? And so I'm really hopeful that everyone who's here tonight will help take a step in sort of understanding the truth about eating disorders and shutting down some of that judgment so that people can really get help and feel like there is a safe space to be seen, that this won't hurt them or their future. One of the most common things that we're sort of up against is diet culture, which is prevalent in the world for sure, and also in the femme community in terms of wanting to look a certain way, thinking that being a certain size will be better. That all really stem from this myth that like, if you're thin, you're healthy, which is just not true. This is a subject that I could talk about as a separate topic for hours, and I teach a course on this, and it's like most of the course is people trying to contest this idea. Again, not making it up. This is based on research. There's a great book called Anti-Diet by Christy Harrison, and also a book called Body Respect by Linda Bacon. And these books show the research on how this like misconception that if you're thin, you're healthy, and how people say, oh, that food is healthy. What do they mean? They usually mean like low calorie. They think it's green, things like that, that promotes that there is bad food and good food, which is one of the most hurtful things for people in recovery, but also at large, because then people start to limit the bad food. And then what do? They obsess about the bad food, and then they have the bad food, and then they feel shame. They think I've been bad, when in reality, it's okay to have that food. It's important to have variety and to not live life restricting in that manner. And so part of what has been so prevalent is really this idea of who's looking at who. I need to be a certain size, that has, I think, lent itself towards some of the secrecy and also the promotion of diet culture and a thin ideal that, again, is not at all limited to the femme community. And we see it. I don't think we can deny that. And sort of, look at all of our look, most holidays, there's food. 4th of July, there are hot dogs. Holidays involve food, but look at how, there's this idea of like, we need to make so much food, but don't eat it. But no, are you eating? You need to eat something. No, but that's too much. There's so much, this like very limited space of what is okay and what looks okay. The same with appearance. People, the classic kind of cliche is like, that person has lost so much weight. Do you think they're okay? And then if the person is, at just a certain body type, they'll say like, oh, and that person, oh, they gained so much weight. It's like, well, what is the middle ground? And we don't know people's stories. But at the end of the day, health is, it's sort of a side note, but I want to stress enough, health is not determined by size. There are correlations. It's important to move our bodies. It's important to have variety. But there are so many people who have serious illnesses, whether it's medical or an eating disorder, who are not taken seriously because they're not in a smaller body. And that might sound like, wait, what does that have to do with all this? It's directly related to this, because then it creates a space in a world where we are only accepting of certain body types, which then makes people feel like they will not be accepted if they're not in a particular body type. And whether that leads to binging and purging, binging and restricting and exercising, there's this idea of I am only worthy if I look X way. And that's heartbreaking, because our worth, as everyone here I think can agree on, is based on so much, not even so much more. It's not based on that. That's our body esteem, how we feel about how we look. Yes, that's part of being human. But when we ascribe our worth and our acceptance and our ability to cope on only if I look this way, we're really shutting down an opportunity for growth and connection. So I want to note that part of what we can do is first addressing this fat phobia. Let's just call it what it is, and be more accepting. And note that, again, I'm sure there are so many people listening to this saying, no, but doctor, she's not a doctor, and doctors. And I've heard from so many heartbreaking stories of people who go to the doctor and have an ailment. The doctor does not even look them in the eye and says, just go lose weight. And these people have fractures in their wrists. There's people who actually, I know this to be a fact, someone who had a tumor that was left growing because the doctor just kept saying, you'll be better if you just lose some weight. And these might sound like extreme cases, but it's all in the same spectrum of not allowing people to be in the bodies that they need to be, and saying that they need to limit and that we need to shrink ourselves. When in reality, we should be making room for us, both, physically, however we need to, and emotionally and metaphorically expanding ourselves and connecting and not judging in that way. So that is actually a key part of prevention, honestly, is being accepting and promoting self-worth, not based on appearance. So that includes like, we got to stop making fat jokes and saying, no, you're not fat, you're beautiful, because that implies, so if I'm beautiful, I can't be fat, / if I'm fat, I can't be beautiful. No, if someone, there's a reclaiming of the word fat, even saying like, if someone is fat, they can be fat and also beautiful. And not sort of shying away from this idea that we are all meant to be the same body type, because we're not. And again, check if you're sort of like, nope, don't believe it. Check out those two books I mentioned, because there is medical research in there. So Body Respect and Anti-Diet, Christy Harrison. There's also a lot of great resources that, sort of show where all these things come from. So that's one thing. The other thing is sort of, I mentioned this, but promoting ideas of internal self-worth. And so, if you're thinking about someone in your life that you just like, someone you care about, just picture someone you care about, and you see them out in public or whatever it is, instead of saying like, oh my gosh, you look amazing. Oh, it's so good to see you. Promoting the idea that like we are meant to connect with each other based on our values and what we bring to the world, and not how we look. Now, again, eating disorders are not all about how we look. So I know this might sound confusing because that's what I'm focusing on. But the more you promote the internal, and the more you promote acceptance of emotions, that people can cry, whatever their gender, that people can share how they feel, that all feelings are okay. Sometimes behavior is based on feelings. This is sort of like, we learn this with toddlers. You can't hit, but you can totally feel angry. So learning how to accept each other's emotions and to make a space for that to be okay, and to not joke about sizes, and to not make jokes about, and this should be obvious, not make jokes about eating disorders, and to try to notice and, name our judgments in terms of if someone is seeking help, to not say, oh, what is that? No, someone seeking help, that's wonderful that someone recognizes that they need help and they're asking for it. We're not meant to be superhumans who don't ever need help from anyone. So promoting an atmosphere as we're sort of raising each other, whatever the generation, of acceptance and self-worth is key. Also, if someone asks for help, if someone comes forward, whether you are in a career where that is likely to happen, or whether you're part of a community, or you're a parent or a friend, whatever it is, don't turn them away. I would say thank them even, or you don't have to thank them, but show your appreciation that they came to you, and not minimizing, oh, it's not really a problem. Oh, it's a phase. It's not a phase. Make space where people can ask for help and, make connections in terms of resources. There are plenty out there that can support that. I think I'm going to pause there in terms of our time, because I want to be able to answer questions. So if there are questions, I would say, I know that was sort of an abrupt pause, but I want to make sure there's time, or if there's an area that I haven't gotten to yet, things like that, now would be a good time that I can sort of hear feedback about what else you want to know.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I appreciate it. There are a few questions that came in. I'm going to read them to you and you could respond.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that this could start at a very, very young age. The question is, what is the way to start identifying or recognizing some of the issues at such a young age? Is there a difference in recognizing and identifying the problem at different ages? If someone is 11 versus 19 or something like that?
Sure, that's a great question. So I should say that what I would recommend, I know this wasn't the question, but I'm going to backtrack, in terms of prevention, is that everyone here, whoever you are, go pick up the book Intuitive Eating, because learning how to eat intuitively and trust our hunger and fullness / like our emotions, and raising kids, there's a great chapter on division of responsibility. It sort of sets the stage where like there can be acceptance as opposed to cutting kids off from certain foods and things like that. So that's just a side note, but that triggered that thought for me. So in terms of at this young age, look, for kids that young, a lot of the times what's coming out now is ARFID, which stands for Avoidant and Restrictive Food Intake Disorder. So it can look like extreme picky eating. It often comes with a fear of textures of some kind. Now, there are some people who say, okay, my kid had that, they grew out of it. But when it's becoming sort of obsessive in the sense that the kid is really not eating whole groups of food, things like that, that does not mean I'm diagnosing that as, oh, the kid has an eating disorder, but that is common at a young age. And there are a whole, that's sort of coming out more and more. Sometimes it comes from a fear of choking or an experience where witnessing someone struggling to eat or something like that. So that's something just to keep your eyes on in terms of just like noticing. And I would say the first step, is bringing that up with the doctor, with a feeding specialist, with a dietitian. When someone is trying to recover, the best team, if you will, is a therapist, dietitian, not nutritionist. There are great nutritionists out there, but a dietitian has gone to school and has a degree and taken an exam, whereas technically I could say I'm a nutritionist. And psychiatrist and medical doctor, who all specialize in eating disorders. So typically not someone who says, oh yeah, I've worked with a few cases before, or not someone who advertises weight loss, not a dietitian. It's not a good idea, but people who specialize. So contacting someone and saying, hey, can we have an evaluation? If it's for a kid that young, probably want to find someone who says they have an ARFID specialty. In terms of the different ages, there's not much of a difference, to be honest. Now, for some folks, you know, as they get older, there are symptoms that could come in. So for a female who had her menstrual cycle, and whether it's restricting or binging, even, you know, like it's sort of their body's very confused and gets halted. That does not always happen. That could be information. Whereas for someone who's 9, they may not have had their menstrual cycle to begin with. So for someone who's had it and lost it, it's called secondary amenorrhea. For someone who never had it, it's called amenorrhea. So there are symptoms like that, but even that's not a marker of if someone is sick enough or not, quote unquote. So I think it's more about the full picture in terms of what the person is reporting, looking at also the life stage. So noticing how, if it's, you know, a kid going into first grade versus someone going into college, that those are both transitions where the person could be feeling lost, alone. A lot of young kids are also modeling. So look, I'm not here to convince you how to live in terms of dieting and not dieting, but I would just say, don't talk about it in front of your kids, because they pick up on it, they see it. And even if they think, oh, my mom always lets me have whatever I want, what I know to be true is that they think, but when I'm an adult, I have to diet just like my mom. Or like, that's what older people do. They diet. So I'm not a fan of diets. Again, intuitive eating, check it out. But if you are, okay, do not talk about it in front of your kids. Let them have a variety of foods. Do not label food as, you know, good, bad, junk food, things like that. And know that like they pick up on things. So eat with them. Again, this is more prevention than it is like what to notice, but it feels just important to me of, if you're always busy and you're not eating with them, then they don't have someone to model off of for really young kids, how to eat the food. But also for older kids, if you will, you know, the expectation that like, you're supposed to eat that food. And then they think, well, my mom doesn't, so why should I? Or whatever it is. So just as a note.
Thank you. The next question is, if you believe someone has an eating disorder, how do you approach them? And I guess the second question, a follow-up to that would be, is if someone does have an eating disorder, how do you support them, whether a family member or just someone else you know?
Yeah. Okay. Great question. So in terms of how to approach them, the main rule, if you will, is don't talk about the food and don't talk about their body. So, you know, people think that will like get to the person of like, we're so worried about you. For someone who's struggling, that can almost feel like this gold medal of like, oh, people are worried. Again, this is an irrational disorder, but because it's almost like, oh, it must be working. So instead it's approaching the person and saying, I really care about you. I've like noticed some differences in you. Maybe it's like, I don't see you as much, or I feel like something has shifted. And I really care about you. So how can I be there for you? Now, if there's a concern and the person is just denying, first of all, say that a few times. There are so many people who have told me that they heard that and that's how they knew who to go to when they finally felt ready to admit there was a problem. If there's a concern to the point of, I don't know if this person is safe, there's also so much, I didn't mention this, but there's so much comorbidity in terms of eating disorders with other types of mental health concerns or issues. So substance use, self-injurious behaviors or self-harm, like I mentioned, their trauma, a host of things, really. If there's a concern on any level about danger, then it gets tricky. So if it's someone who is an adolescent, it's probably going to a parent or someone in the school, someone that you can trust. If it is for an adult, trying to find sort of a common denominator for that person who can help really support the idea that there is concern, that you care, really just like kind of driving that home. There are times where people have gotten help by their friends saying to them, like, I think it would be so helpful if you talk to someone. Do you want me to go with you to that first appointment? And that's what got them there. Or saying, do you want me to help you find somebody? I've had so many calls from people who say, like, I'm this person's friend. I told them I'll take care of the whole process because they're just so overwhelmed, or they don't even know if they want to. So I think that there are things you can do in terms of trying to find help and resources. And ultimately, you know, sometimes it takes for some folks seeing the feedback from, you know, they'll say, well, no, you're my mom. But a doctor sometimes saying, like, you know, it has to be an informed doctor who's not going to say that thing of like, oh, you're not sick enough. But someone saying, like, look, your labs might be normal, let's just say, and the way you're treating your body, it's not going to keep holding out like this. And sort of helping to support and move through the denial, which will most likely come from a place of supportive language and not blaming or judging or focusing on behaviors.
The next question is regarding emotional trauma and triggers, and how does that affect eating disorders? And I guess specifically, maybe if I can add to that question of triggers for eating disorders, or how that would work, and how that plays a role.
Okay, so I think if I'm understanding the question correctly, trauma is often, you know, emotional trauma and PTSD often play a major role there. I don't know the statistic off the top of my head. My memory is not that great with those types of things, unfortunately, but plays a large role that so many people who struggle with an eating disorder have trauma. And so sometimes it is a feeling of feeling unsafe in the body. And then the process of recovery can feel so hard because the person is being asked to connect or reconnect with their body, which feels really challenging. And sometimes the eating disorder is a way of kind of escaping or altering the body. For some folks, like, you know, I mentioned earlier, it could be this sort of major distraction from a trauma. So there are some clients who will go for treatment, let's just say at a higher level of care, a program of some kind, and they learn to eat again and not get rid of their food or whatever it is. And they don't really address that trauma, and they often come back because they realize they have to really do those two things together in terms of addressing the underlying catalyst. And it's never one thing. Eating disorders are not born overnight. It's not one cause, but maybe it's like the main catalyst or the main thing that's kind of keeping it alive. And so looking at that trauma and working through it, and in therapy, really, in terms of whether it's, you know, the different trauma modalities, there's CPT, EMDR, somatic experiencing, many of them, and knowing that there is going to be likely this trigger by asking the person to reconnect with their body that they're likely trying to avoid, and that it is doable but may require more support. So whether that's being safe in a higher level of care, or working first on coping skills, whatever it is.
In a one line, if we could put it in one sentence, what is the treatment for eating disorders?
Ooh, that is a challenge. One line. The person learning how to cope and sit with distress and not sort of take it out on the body. That's sort of like.
And do they have to do that with professional help?
I would say it's very rare that it's not, the person can get fully recovered without some type of help. It can happen, but the recommendation is to have a therapist, to have a team.
Okay. And then I think there's a final question that came in. How do you know the difference between a picky eater and an eating disorder? If I could use an example, I found a chewed up chocolate chip cookie in my kid's coat. Maybe they didn't like the chocolate chip cookie. Maybe it's an eating disorder. Obviously, I made that example up. Yeah. Most, at least my kids, they're not going to spit the cookie out. But how do you differentiate the difference between a picky eater, the kid that doesn't like cucumbers, versus the kid that actually has a real eating disorder, and knowing that you need to take that to the next level for help?
Yeah, usually the key factor is the emotional distress that comes with like the thought of having the food. You know, so there could be, and look, this is an area, it's sort of it's not a newer disorder, but more is coming out. So I'd be the first to say, I'm always the first to admit when I'm not, oh, that's one that I need to know more information about. I've worked with folks with ARFID before, but usually it's this level of emotional distress and fear, and the fears are quite irrational, as opposed to I don't like that food. I like that other food better. There's more of a heightened reaction typically.
Okay, let me look. I think that's it. Oh, actually, one more question came in. Hold on one second.
No worries.
So the last question, and I'm going to rephrase it. We live from a Orthodox community. Food is a major role in our lifestyle. Shabbos meal, we're all overeating. And Yom Tov meals, we're all overeating. So the question is, how does that play a role in eating disorders? And with that, the difference between snacks throughout the day and eating set meals. How can that trigger eating disorders? Our lifestyle and our eating, or having different snacks versus meals and things of the sort, or is it? Let me stop over because I have a follow-up question afterwards. Yeah.
So that alone would not trigger an eating disorder. Now the mentality, so that's the whole thing. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. So there's always, you can have a house with 11 kids and one of them has an eating disorder. They all have the same, food in front of them. So it's not like that is what causes it in any way, or is like the main thing. I do think that it can be tricky and unhelpful. I will say that, in terms of the disordered eating that is so rampant of all these meals that we're probably, like you said, eating past fullness, which is okay to do, it's not the worst crime. But it's more so to me, the language around the food of I'll be good today. I won't have this, or I'm going to be bad. And I'm going to have, oh my gosh, we're not bad or good, depending on if we have cheesecake on Shavuos or not, that's not how this works. So I think that it's actually more about the mindset. And if it can be this gathering and a feeling of connection and community of we're gathered around this food, we're going to eat what we want, as opposed to you better not have that extra portion. That's, I think, when it becomes a problem.
So as parents, how do we limit our children sometimes in the eating of certain foods, right? If you give a kid an ice cream tub, they're going to eat the whole thing. How do we limit them only one scoop or only one slice of challah, or whatever it is? Not even necessarily because the child is overweight, just simply because it's the right thing to do and it not becoming an eating disorder.
Yeah. So 2 things about that. First of all, if you would do it for the kid, I know you didn't say this, but this is a very important point. If you do it for the kid who is in a bigger body, but not for the kid in a smaller body, there's a problem. Because then we've given up this whole idea of, it's health, right? Because it's the same thing. There's a classic thing of you tell this other person in a bigger body, go eat a salad, but and that's not me, but it's a thing, I only eat pizza and I smoke 2 packs a day, but you never tell me about health because I'm thin. So we have to note that as a question, just to think about. My answer to that is, it's really checking out the intuitive eating book and division of responsibility, in the sense that if you are saying to kids, you can only have 1 scoop of ice cream, but have as many cucumbers as you want, it's a problem. It's showing the kids the ice cream is bad, the cucumbers are good. We need to have sort of a neutral approach. Now, they're 100%, it could be that there's a kid who, only will eat the ice cream. If it's not because they've been taught that ice cream is special, then the division of responsibility would teach that you kind of put in front of the kid what they're going to have, and that's their choice. But you need to do it in a way that you're promoting variety and not saying that any food is bad. And what's achieved when you do that, I've seen this from so many people who it's really, again, research-based, not making it up, get the book, is that when they give the kid for a Shabbos party, they take out all the candy. For a kid who's been taught that all food is okay, they say, I want the licorice. Okay, I'm good. Because they're not thinking Shabbos party, it's the first time I can have this food all week. I have to stash it and hide it and hoard it. They're just thinking it's food. Just I don't love that other food. This tastes good. But it's not taught to them as it's only special and only if you're good will you get it, kind of a thing.
So based on that, are we allowed to force our children to try food? And I know force is the wrong word, but are we allowed to pressure our kids to try foods? They look at a certain item. They have no desire to try the celery stick or the carrot stick. How do we go about encouraging them to try those foods, and not necessarily even healthy foods, other foods as well?
Sure. Yes. Put it in front of them. I mean, I will just disclose, I have a 2-year-old who Today she had broccoli for the first time. I have put it in front of her probably 25 times and she has never had it. And today she did. And she was like, broccoli. And I was like, yeah, it's great. And I give her a full variety, and I'm just sharing one example, but yes, put variety of foods. When kids say, no, I don't like that, say to them, okay, I'm going to put it on your plate. If you don't end up having it, you don't end up having it. But instead of saying, okay, you don't like it, so here, have this. What are you going to have? Really being open that like food is food and trying something, more than once. I think I don't know, it's 15 times. There's a statistic that you learn when you're a dietitian. Don't say to someone that they're allowed to say they don't like the food unless they've tried it a certain number of times or attempted it. So I think, let's try different options, but not stressing like you need to have the celery. It's so healthy for you. Please don't have the M&Ms. Like that's not a great direction to go in.
Okay, and the final question, part of the healing process is facing the reality situation that can be very, very scary for some. How do we be the support, or maybe say, how do we approach and be the support to that family member or loved one that is scared or may be scared to face the true challenge that faces them and how difficult it can be with people struggling with eating disorders?
Yeah. There's a spectrum of those challenges. Sometimes a challenge means that person has to leave their home. Let's just say, that actually they cannot recover unless they, and I'm not talking, not saying that that's a rule, but just as a note. Or it may be, and I say leave their home, maybe because of an environment, maybe because they need to spread their wings. Or it could be that they need to leave a certain relationship. Or it could be that they need to sit with the discomfort that they will not be perfect and that not everyone will love them in life. And some people will, and some people won't. So I would say the main thing to do is validate, help the person feel seen, support this dialectic idea when they say, oh, but I won't be perfect, saying well, you're perfect to me. That's not helpful. Saying to them well, you're going to be great at some things and not at others. This kind of approach of accepting the person as they are and letting them know that even though you might not understand what it's like to have an eating disorder, this is so essential. You can understand how it is to be a friend or to be a sister or a parent, and ask them so what do you need? And no, this is helpful. Their answer to that could be, I'm not sure, or it could be, this is what I need. And then you do that. And the next day they say, why'd you do that? I can't believe you just did that. So it's a very, very painful process. So being patient with the person, having good boundaries, but letting them know that you're here with them and that you might not get it. Because we never really get anything that someone else is going through, even if you have the same exact diagnosis, but that you can sit by with them as they're in pain and that, you're hopeful for them for the future.
The book is called Intuitive Eating.
Intuitive Eating.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, Temimah Zucker, we really enjoyed and appreciate your time, your guidance, your advice. We thank Operation Survival and Yankee Berman for putting on this event, as well as COL Live and CrownHeights.info will put on this most important event. It will be available on YouTube in about an hour, I believe, so feel free to share it. Once again, the book that Temimah Zucker suggests everybody buy or read is Intuitive Eating. Reminding you, May 4th, which is a week away, we will be having Dr. Shlomi Zimmerman, who will be talking, continuing this lecture series. Temimah, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. And as we mentioned earlier, we are in the month of Iyar Ani Hashem Refecha. Hashem should send us all the healing that we need in our lives, physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. Of course, the greatest of all healing will bring the coming of Mashiach, the true Geula Shlema, and wishing you a good night.